Welcome back, everyone. Welcome back, everyone. Before we begin this last session, I'd like to remind you that we have conference feedback forms in your packets. There are also some at the registration desk. Please, before you leave, if you would fill these out for us, we greatly appreciate your feedback. So they're blue. You'll find them in your packet, or again at the registration desk. You can turn them in there as well. So my name is Kathy Corey. I'm in the theology department here at St. Thomas, on loan to the history department, so they don't see me too much in theology right now. But I am very pleased to be able to introduce to you Dr. Bill Cavanaugh. Dr. Cavanaugh is director of the Center for World Catholicism and Intercultural Theology at DePaul University, where he is also professor of Catholic Studies. He is the author of several books. A couple are here for sale, including Torture and Eucharist, Theology, Politics, and the Body of Christ, Theopolitical Imagination, Discovering the Liturgy as a Political Act in the Age of Global Consumerism, Being Consumed, Economics and Christian Desire. You start to see a theme? The Myth of Religious Violence, Secular Ideology and the Roots of Modern Conflict, and Migrations of the Holy, Theologies of State and Church. Each of these have been translated into other languages, and 2 have received National Book Awards. In addition, Dr. Cavanaugh has authored nearly 80 articles and essays in journals and collected works on topics related to his areas of expertise: political theology, economic ethics, and ecclesiology, or theology of church. And he has edited several other major works. A prodigious writer and a widely known and respected public speaker, we are proud to say that he got his start here at the University of St. Thomas. Today's presentation is entitled Return of the Golden Calf, Economy, Idolatry, and Secularization Since Gaudium at Spes. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Bill Cavanaugh.
Well, thanks, Kathy, for that kind introduction, and thanks to the organizers of the conference, Massimo, Bernie, Lori, everybody that's been involved in that. It's been really a wonderful homecoming for me here, and so great to see so many good friends and to feel at home again in Minnesota. We were here for 15 years, and I still, I hear Garrison Keillor's voice, and my heart is strangely warmed. And it's just as I remember it being. This is just the typical winter day in Minnesota, and it's just the palm trees swaying in the breeze, and it's. I was asked to talk about economics in particular, and it's hard to talk about this subject without thinking about all of Pope Francis's recent comments, and I'm thinking in particular about his comments about idolatry, and that's going to be the theme of this. Pope Francis has widely been credited with reviving the spirit of Vatican II. Eugene Cullen Kennedy has written recently, perhaps a fitting standalone description for Pope Francis is, "I am Vatican II." According to Kennedy, the world had in the Vatican I Church always been regarded as part of a sinister triumvirate with the flesh and the devil. Vatican II took a much more positive view of the world, and Pope Francis has likewise been intent on serving its needs more than condemning its faults. And Pope Francis has signaled his continuity with Vatican II in many different gestures and words. Now, I think the broad outlines of the story are absolutely right. This embrace of the world, and that's very much in the spirit of Pope Francis. When it comes to his statements on economic matters, though, he appears to depart from this script rather dramatically. One of the most frequently recurring images that Francis has used for the contemporary economy is that of idolatry. Indeed, Pope Francis virtually never talks about the economy without leveling the charge of idolatry, a charge absent from the discussion of economics in Gaudium et Spes, and almost entirely absent from Vatican II as a whole. So what accounts for the difference between the treatment of economic matters in Gaudium et Spes and that of Pope Francis? To answer that question, I want to look at background ideas about secularization both then and now, and I'll begin by examining the text of Gaudium et Spes and the writings and speeches of Pope Francis on economic matters. I'll then explore the background of 1960s treatments of secularization among progressive Catholic writers, showing how they tended to view secular fields such as the economy as neutral, autonomous, disenchanted. I'll then show how scholarship on the secular has changed since the 1960s and how a consumerist economy is often seen as enchanted and religious. And finally, I'll suggest that Pope Francis's attacks on idolatry of money can be understood in the spirit of Vatican II, not as a negative judgment on the world, but as an identification of and with the world's deepest longings. So the majority of the Council Fathers wanted to turn the world, turn towards the world and away from a defensive posture that had marked the Church since the French Revolution. Gaudium et Spes has been accused of a facile historical optimism of a Western kind, in Giuseppe Alberigo's words, but the charge I don't think is entirely fair, although there is plenty of language of growth, evolution, progress, and maturity of man. It's always man in the text. Such language is tempered by a recognition of various social problems and of sin as the foundation of those problems. Nevertheless, there is little sense in Gaudium et Spes that the opponents of the gospel in the world are in the grip of something larger than themselves. The treatment of atheism, which the Council regards as among the most serious problems of this age, as they say, is instructive in this regard. Atheism is treated as a lack, a subtraction of a sense of God from the world. People interpret scientific progress and humanism as a call to reject religion as magical and superstitious. The document says atheists are treated as sincere and rational people. Atheism is not a form of belief, but a form of unbelief, often motivated by protest against evil or against the hypocrisy of religious believers. Some forms of atheism pursue, quote, the liberation of man, especially through his economic and social emancipation, end quote, which requires turning from otherworldly to this-worldly concerns. Although atheists are grievously misguided, the Council seeks to engage them in prudent and sincere dialogue so that they might examine the gospel of Christ with an open mind. Those are quotes. In the tradition of Schleiermacher's address to the cultured despisers of Christianity, Gaudium et Spes often seems directed toward an educated, middle-class, rapidly secularizing European audience. The Church's competitors for this audience were Marxists and existentialists, which are clearly referenced in paragraph 10. In the debate over Schema 13, bishops from the Third World complained that the document was too First World in its approach, too focused on secularization and communism, and the complaint was likewise directed at the final versions. Sections like that in paragraph 61 I find kind of funny. It recommends using one's leisure time for tourism and sports activities, and that only kind of reinforces the impression that bourgeois Europeans were both the primary authors and the primary intended audience. The chapter of Gaudium et Spes that deals specifically with economic matters is not marked by a simple optimism. The document recognizes reasons for anxiety, such as materialism and inequality, but by the conviction that the problems can and should be addressed by sincere and rational persons. Our contemporaries are coming to feel these inequalities with ever sharper awareness, since they are thoroughly convinced that the ampler technical and economic possibilities which the world of today enjoys can and should correct this unhappy state of affairs. Hence, many reforms in the socio... Hi, Siri. How are you? Oh, goodness. Yeah, I'm going to have to write a different talk if Siri's going to understand everything. Oh, thanks, Phil. The technology is wonderful. I got a kick out of watching the three elderly people with the microphone kind of trying to figure it out after Leslie's talk. By elderly, I mean my age and above. My IT person is my 17-year-old son. Anyway, hence many reforms in the socioeconomic realm and a change of mentality and attitude are required of all. For this reason, the Church down through the centuries and in the light of the gospel has worked out the principles of justice and equity demanded by right reason, both for individual and social life. The list of such required reforms and changes of mentality is long. Inequalities should be removed. There should be an increase in access to markets and fair income. There should be no discrimination against migrants. The dignity of labor should be recognized. Work should be adapted to the needs of the person, and so on. And all of these recommendations, of course, are good, and together they add up to a picture of a sound economy. Though the recommendations are mostly of a very general nature, the Council Fathers did take a few bold initiatives. Their support for land reform, for example, had direct import in Latin America, where expropriation was a hot topic in the 1960s. This section of Gaudium et Spes on economics has been faulted for its general moralizing and its failure to get advice from professionals in the field of economics. But the Council Fathers did not intend to do more than what they say, as the quote goes, provide principles of justice and equity demanded by right reason, the details of which were to be worked out by professional economists. According to Gaudium et Spes, quote, economic activity is to be carried on according to its own methods and laws within the limits of the moral order, end quote. The autonomy and rationality of the economic sphere is implied by the document's earlier insistence on the autonomy of earthly affairs and the rightful independence of the sciences. Those are quotes, which includes the science of economics. This autonomy is not, of course, to the exclusion of God. The autonomy of earthly affairs, as they say, is not merely required by modern man, but harmonizes also with the will of the Creator. For by the very circumstance of their having been created, all things are endowed with their own stability, truth, goodness, proper laws, and order. End quote. So what the gospel adds to the laws of economics are guiding principles that stake out the limits of the moral order. Now, from the vantage point of 50 years later, the section on economics is remarkable for what's missing. There's no mention at all of the monetary system. Consumption and consumerism are likewise almost entirely absent, except for maybe the brief contrast in paragraph 63 between those who lack the necessities of life and those who live in luxury. According to the Council Fathers, the number swells of the people who raise the most basic questions or recognize them with a new sharpness. What is man? And they see no constantly swelling number of people who just want a new TV, right? The realm of economics, oh, am I behind here? Sorry. Right. So according to the Council, the number constantly swells of the people who raise the most basic questions or recognize them with a new sharpness. What is man? And they see no constantly swelling number of people who just want a new TV, right? The realm of economics remains the realm of sober and rational men attempting to properly arrange the material world of goods. Lacking is any mention of sin in the section of Gaudium et Spes on economic activity. There's certainly what they call a lack of economic and social balance in many areas, but there's no mention of sin as a cause of those imbalances. There is, needless to say, no mention of idolatry. Both the Marxists and the capitalists that the document seems to have in view are the Western European kind. The Marxists sincere and scientific, the capitalists hardworking and responsible for a general post-war economy, or post-war prosperity. The Eastern European voices at the Council that clamored for a condemnation of totalitarian Marxism, and the Third World voices that decried the terrible suffering of millions excluded from capitalist prosperity, were reflected only in muted ways in the final version of Gaudium et Spes. So on to Pope Francis then. Despite the centrality of the concept of idolatry to the biblical witness, and despite the importance of Scripture to the Council, the concept of idolatry had very little impact in the proceedings of Vatican II. In the 1,000 or so pages of the final Council documents, in my version anyway, the old Flannery version, derivations of the word idol or idolatry appear just 3 times in passing. By way of contrast, idolatry is an important concept for Pope Francis. His first encyclical, Lumen Fidei, uses the word idols or idolatry 14 times. There the Pope declares that the opposite of faith is not a simple lack of belief, but idolatry. When one stops believing in God, one does not simply stop believing. Rather, one believes in all sorts of things, an aimless passing from one Lord to another, as Pope Francis says. Francis has repeatedly made clear that these lords that people worship need not be explicitly named gods. For Francis, as for the Bible, idolatry is not merely a problem of the worship of celestial beings other than the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. In the Bible, idolatry includes giving priority to created things like military might, bodily appetites, right? Paul says in the Philippians, their God is their bellies, and wealth. According to Colossians, greed is the same thing as worshiping a false god. That's Colossians 3:5. Jesus personifies mammon not because people explicitly worshiped a god of that name, but because people have a tendency to put their trust in money rather than in the one true God. Pope Francis has famously decried the idolatry of the contemporary global economy in Evangelii Gaudium, and his language is unsparing and personal. Quote, "Such an economy kills. How can it be that it is not a news item when an elderly homeless person dies of exposure, but it is news when the stock market loses 2 points? At the heart of the problem," he says, "is a crude and naive trust in the goodness of those wielding economic power and in the sacralized workings of the prevailing economic system. The economy is not, then, an autonomous secular realm guided by well-meaning technocrats. It's sacralized. Gross inequality is the result of ideologies which defend the absolute autonomy of the marketplace and financial speculation. The market, says Francis, has become absolutized so that the true God can appear only as an unmanageable threat and the poor and the environment a nuisance to the interests of a deified market." He says, "We have created new idols. The worship of the ancient golden calf has returned in a new and ruthless guise in the idolatry of money and the dictatorship of an impersonal economy lacking a truly human purpose." You might recognize that as the bull on Wall Street. Evangelii Gaudium caused consternation among defenders of free market ideology when it appeared in November of 2013. But its language on economics was not new. It was taken almost verbatim from an address Pope Francis gave to a group of ambassadors in May of that year. Indeed, Pope Francis has made the idolatry of money and the contemporary economy a consistent theme that he's repeated to audiences of all kinds. A week after his address to the ambassadors, Pope Francis gave a homily to the Italian Episcopal Conference in which he prayed, quote, "Save us from the idolatry of the present time," idolatry which includes, as he says, the enticement of money. In a general audience of June 2013, the Pope decried the dynamics of an economy where no longer humans but money commands. Quote, "Men and women are sacrificed to the idols of profit and consumption. It is the culture of waste. Consumerism has induced us to be accustomed to excess." Later that year, in a meeting with workers, the Pope repeatedly used the language of idolatry, denouncing, quote, "an economic system centered on an idol called money, and this idolatrous economic system According to Pope Francis, quote, God did not want an idol to be at the center of the world, but men and women, who would keep the world going with their work. And yet now, in this system devoid of ethics, at the center there is an idol, and the world has become an idolater of this god money. End quote. Pope Francis counsels not resignation, but resistance. Quote, let us be cunning, for the Lord tells us that idols are more clever than we are. End quote. Again, a month later, Pope Francis addressed the question of money, suggesting that it should not be demonized since it contributes to many good works, but warning that just as Jesus said we cannot serve two masters, God and money, we must choose between two roads. God's road of humility, of bending down to serve, or the road of covetousness, which ends in idolatry. Now, in the light of criticism since the publication of Evangelii Gaudium, Pope Francis has not backed away from his persistent denunciation of economic idolatry. In an interview with a Spanish newspaper in June of 2014, the Pope continued to attack what he called the idolatry of money and idolatrous economies. In his most recent interview to appear in print, an excerpt from the book Pope Francis, This Economy Kills, Pope Francis repeats his concern about the idolatry of money and restates Jesus' saying about God and wealth. And he goes further in defining the characteristics of idolatry, saying, quote, poverty leads one away from idolatry, from feeling self-sufficient, end quote. And it's this feeling of self-sufficiency, the refusal to recognize one's dependence on God, that marks idolatry. Wealth itself is not the problem. The Pope says, quote, the gospel does not condemn the rich, but rather the idolatry of wealth, the idolatry that renders one insensitive to the cry of the poor. Now, I could add more examples to this, but I think the point should be clear enough by now. The approaches of Gaudium et Spes and Pope Francis on the questions of economy are different. Pope Francis doesn't believe that the economy is an autonomous secular realm amenable to technocratic solutions guided by principles of right reason. Francis believes that the global economy is dominated by a new idolatrous religion. So what accounts for that difference between Francis and Gaudium et Spes? We're accustomed to running differences within the post-Vatican II church through dichotomies like progressive and conservative, optimistic and pessimistic, Thomist and Augustinian, world-affirming, world-denying, and so on. I don't think any of those dichotomies really help in this case. To say that Francis has turned his back on Vatican II, of course, would be ridiculous. And to say that he's world-denying or bears an Augustinian pessimism about the world would be equally unhelpful. In his homily for World Youth Day, Pope Francis warned of the attraction of idols such as money, success, and pleasure, and he located the roots of such idolatry in a sense of emptiness felt by many people. But he then proclaimed, let us maintain a positive outlook on reality and encourage the young people present to be hopeful, open to being surprised by God, and joyful. Christians are joyful. They are never gloomy. God is at our side. Sin and death have been defeated. Christians cannot be pessimists. And there he is again at World Youth Day, giving the thumbs up to the world, right? Now, I don't think that Francis's approach to economics can be attributed to his temperament or his training in a particular school of thought. I do think it is in part traceable to his proximity to the poor in Latin America, where promises of the well-being that the free market is always just about to but never actually does ring increasingly hollow. But it's not so, my point in this paper is not so much to trace a genealogy of Pope Francis's thinking. I'm more interested in situating his critique of capitalism as a false religion within wider changes in the intellectual climate since Gaudium et Spes. In particular, I want to contrast Catholic approaches to secularization in the 1960s to where the conversation on secularization is today. And my hypothesis is that Gaudium et Spes was written in a context of what Charles Taylor has called subtraction theories of secularization, theories that seem much less plausible today. The 1960s were the heyday of what is commonly called the secularization thesis, a broad consensus among sociologists and others that, as Peter Berger put it, modernization necessarily leads to a decline of religion. The advance of science, capitalism, and the differentiation of society into separate religious and secular spheres was understood predominantly as a stripping away of public belief in magical, transcendent forces, leaving a purely immanent residue behind. In Max Weber's term, the rationalization that characterizes modernity leads inexorably to disenchantment, the usual translation for Weber's term Entzauberung, the loss of Zauber, magic, right? As Taylor comments, according to subtraction theories, what emerges from this process, modernity or secularity, is to be understood in terms of underlying features of human nature which were there all along, but had been impeded by what is now set aside. So this kind of substrate of transcendence and enchantment and so on is stripped away, and what's left is kind of the real thing that's always there. Secularization in this sense could be celebrated or mourned or turned into an opportunity for the church, but it was widely accepted as fact in the 1960s. How far the subtraction theory of secularization penetrated the thinking of the Council Fathers is difficult to gauge precisely, but if we look at the theological writing of some of the Periti and others representative of the Council's majority, the subtraction theory of secularization becomes more explicit. The issue of the journal Concilium on sacralization and secularization, which appeared in 1969, for example, takes some version of the subtraction thesis as its starting point. The preface of the issue, written by Anton Weiler of Nijmegen, declares that, quote, "The mentality of the human individual today is very different from that prevailing in the old cultures and their understanding of the animated world. Modern man is faced with a world of facts, which have become neutralized." In the first article of the issue, sociologist Leonardus Leyendecker, drawing on the early work of Peter Berger, pins the quote, "loss in social significance of the Christian supra-empirical definition of reality," end quote, on the modern differentiation of society. He says, quote, "We are seeing the rise of social segmentation and a plurality of societies. This makes it impossible, and inevitably so, to maintain one particular definition of reality as the exclusive vehicle of salvation," end quote. So differentiation is the key theme. It's going to be a couple decades later where globalization and the integration of markets and societies becomes an important trope. Although secularization was understood as a disenchantment of the world, Catholic theologians did not simply accept the eventual disappearance of the church and belief in God as inevitable. Indeed, secularization was seen by some as the ripe fruit of the Judeo-Christian tradition itself. As Henricus Fortman explains in the same issue of Concilium, the world for ancient people was animated, filled with numinous powers that were experienced daily as a simple reality. Quote, "Our world, however, is neutral, a framework for research. The outer world is no longer loaded with an other reality. It has become a chain of facts, and facts are there to be investigated in their causes and reactions." Fortman attributes this change to the monotheism of the Bible, which removed God from residing in things and located God above. This process of secularization took a long time to mature, meandering through the Middle Ages and its cults of saints and relics. But finally, in the modern period, the effort to keep God nearby has been broken. Quote, "The Bible in its essence, the church leaders in their more enlightened moments, and science were at one on this point. This can no longer go on. The world has become neutral," end quote. And Fortman considers this a positive development, but appeals to the possibility that, like as he says, the primitive man, the child, and the poet, the believer, can still experience the divine that stands behind the mere neutral facts. Marie-Dominique Chenu, Apparatus at Vatican II and one of the major influences on Gaudium et Spes, likewise thought that the desacralization of the world that accompanies the end of Christendom should be embraced as an opportunity for the Church. For Chenu, the sacred is what is put aside, and he is glad to see that the whole fields of economic organizations, social relations, international coexistence, and cultural values have thus found an autonomy of function and institutional character in a technological civilization. Writing in Concilium in 1966, Claude Giffray chides Chenu for establishing a false opposition between sacred and profane, but he likewise writes of, quote, the opportunity presented by desacralization, provided it's understood in the right way. Quote, insofar as it coincides with a radical exposure of the illusions and idolatries of the religious consciousness, it may paradoxically serve the sacred element of authentic religion in which the faith must be rooted. End quote. For Giffray, idolatry is a problem with religion, not the secular. That's important. Idolatry is a problem with religion and not the secular. He continues to see secularization as a subtraction. Everything becomes controllable in our desacralized universe and no mystery is left. Quote, the growth in man's rational approach goes hand in hand with man's growing ability in production, enjoyment, and technical transformation of the universe. End quote. But the question of meaning goes unanswered. And Giffray therefore sees the imperative to, quote, announce the word of God to a humanity that has become autonomous and has stripped bare a certain amount of religious deviations. For him, the word of God reveals a true element of sacred in the profane that remains once the magical and idolatrous elements of the sacred have been stripped away. Edward Skilobex likewise saw the process of secularization as the stripping away of the presence of magical forces from a material substrate, and he embraced it as the maturation of the biblical view of God and creation. For Skilobex, however, the presence of God in the profane was not so much a remainder in material creation, but was made present in the process of what he called hominization, the impress of humanity on the brute facts of the material world. As Skilobex wrote in 1966, secularization is the movement from a theophanous world to a hominized world. Nature now bears the traces not of man, but of God. Through science and technology, man is no longer bowed before the mysterious forces of nature, but had come rather to dominate and control nature. Skilobex wanted to affirm this movement towards maturity. His interlocutor, he says, is the humanist, but not the broad-minded gentleman of the Renaissance. He says, the modern humanist is more profound, more integral, more serious. He is more matter-of-fact, sober, and real. Both in Marxist and existentialist circles, this humanism is generally framed within a perspective without God, in which all supraterrestrial expectations are firmly excluded, end quote. So such serious and sober people had no time for the transcendent, anything that distracted from the real, empirically accessible world that humanity had finally ceased trying to escape and instead took free responsibility for molding it toward human purposes. And Skilobex had great respect for such humanism, but wanted to rescue it from its atheism. Skilobex regarded the biblical view of God as a fundamental affirmation of the secularity of reality. As Skilobex wrote, quote, the true theological response to the phenomenon of secularization is a refusal to regard God as a factor within this world and a refusal to experience nature directly as numinous. God then is located not in nature but in the human heart. Nature reveals God, but the course of nature, Skilobex writes, quote, tells us more because of God speaking within us than ever it could of itself, end quote. The hominization of history through technological progress then need not imply the banishment of God from history, but only the banishment of idols. Okay, so the intellectual context has changed since the 1960s. Existentialism now seems dated, superseded by postmodern thought. Already in 1966, when Skilobex was taking on the centrality of man in existential thought, Michel Foucault was writing, as the archaeology of our thought easily shows, man is an invention of recent date and one perhaps nearing its end. What Marxists remain in Europe after the fall of the Berlin Wall tend to be of the decidedly post-secular kind, like Slavoj Žižek, for example. The secularization thesis, meanwhile, has fallen on hard times. Peter Berger, who in 1968 wrote that By the 21st century, religious believers are likely to be found only in small sects huddled together to resist a worldwide secular culture, has since confessed, quote, "The world today is as furiously religious as it ever was, and in some places more so than ever. This means that a whole body of literature by historians and social scientists, including himself, loosely labeled secularization theory is essentially mistaken. Modern rationality by itself has not led to a decrease in religious belief. Data compiled by Pippa Norris and Ronald Inglehart indicate that countries where faith in science is stronger also tend to have stronger religious faith," which is interesting. As for the idea that modern differentiation within societies inevitably brings a decline in religious practice, social scientists today tend to believe that religion rises and falls in different times and places according to a whole range of specific factors. The fact that, quote, this is Norris and Inglehart, "the world as a whole now has more people with traditional religious views than ever before, and they constitute a growing proportion of the world's population," end quote, is evidence that the secularization thesis was, ironically, more dogma than science. Now, I'm less interested, though, in the so-called resurgence of religion in recent decades than in the redefinition of religion in another area of scholarship. Beginning with Wilfred Cantwell Smith's landmark book, The Meaning and End of Religion, that appeared just as the Second Vatican Council was starting in 1962, an increasing chorus of scholars has questioned whether the category of religion can be confined to something like belief in God or gods. One group of scholars has been occupied with doing genealogies of religion, to use the title of Talal Assad's influential 1993 book, showing how the religious-secular divide is a modern Western invention. Before modernity, there was no religion and no secular because the worship of God pervaded all aspects of life. While this first group of scholars, sometimes called constructivists, has shown how malleable and contingent the distinction between religious and secular is, a second group of scholars, often called functionalists, has openly expanded the category of religion to include all sorts of phenomena that are usually considered secular. Functionalists prefer to define religion not in terms of what is believed by the religious, but in terms of how they believe it. That is, in terms of the role belief plays in people's lives. So functionalists follow a theme in Emile Durkheim's work in which the sacred-profane distinction depends entirely on the social function of an object, the social function that an object or rite plays. So anything can be a sacred object if it serves to reinforce social order. The national flag, for example, can be a sacred object even though it does not explicitly refer to a supra-empirical being. This is the Crystal Cathedral in California, which is now being renovated into a Catholic cathedral. I don't know if they're going to take the flag down or not, but so again, the point is that there's this whole other line of scholarship that sees that this distinction between religious and secular is not as sharp as it was thought to be in the 1960s. All sorts of things are treated as sacred, as religious objects, and so on. Also influential in this line of thinking has been the recovery of Carl Schmitt's work since the 1990s. Schmitt famously used the term political theology to diagnose the transfer of concepts in modernity from theology to the theory of the sovereign state. The sacred did not disappear in modernity, but was transferred to so-called secular structures, such that, to use Schmitt's examples, the omnipotent God became the omnipotent sovereign lawgiver, or the miracle became the exception in jurisprudence. A host of post-secular thinkers has updated Schmitt's insights for the present. Yale legal theorist Paul Kahn, for example, takes Schmitt for his model in arguing that in the United States, ritualized nationalism and talk of sacrifice and states of emergency reveal the theological basis of so-called secular politics. As Kahn writes, the state is not the secular arrangement it purports to be. A political life is not a life stripped of faith in the experience of the sacred, regardless of what we may believe about the legal separation of church and state, end quote. And this is not simply because Christianity continues to influence the state, but rather because the sacred has migrated to the state. which plays the role that the body of Christ once played in medieval Christendom. The point is not that there's no such thing as secularization, but rather that the contemporary religious-secular distinction does not track the sacred-profane distinction as scholars in the 1960s used to think. In the words of sociologist Jose Casanova, quote, "The modern secular is by no means synonymous with the profane, nor is the religious synonymous with the modern sacred. In this respect, modern secularization entails a certain profanation of religion through its privatization and individualization, and a certain sacralization of the secular spheres of politics, sacred nation, sacred citizenship, sacred constitution, science, temples of knowledge, and economics through commodity fetishism. The breakdown of the neat distinction between the enchanted sacred religion on the one hand and the disenchanted profane secular on the other hand is perhaps most apparent in the area of economics. As George Ritzer has demonstrated in his work on the new means of consumption, in which shopping and entertainment are blurred and cathedrals of consumption, as Ritzer calls them, are constructed, Weber's assumption that greater rationalization inevitably brings disenchantment is false. The corporate systemization of commodified enchantment shows how permeable the concepts of enchantment and rationality are. The analysis of capitalist enchantment, of course, is not new. Karl Marx famously wrote about commodity fetishism, as Casanova refers to, the attribution of mystical qualities to material goods. What is new since the 1960s is the historicization and consequent blurring of the religious-secular divide. An article by David Loy entitled "The Religion of the Market" provides one such example. Loy says, quote, "The religion is notoriously difficult to define. If, however, we adopt a functionalist view and understand religion as what grounds us by teaching us what the world is and what our role in the world is, then it becomes obvious that traditional religions are fulfilling this role less and less because that function is being supplanted, even overwhelmed, by other belief systems and value systems. Today, the most powerful alternative explanation of the world is science, and the most attractive value system has become consumerism. Their academic offspring is economics, probably the most influential of the social sciences. In response, this paper, his paper, will argue that our present economic system should also be understood as our religion, because it has come to fulfill a religious function for us. And I can give many examples of this. Economist Robert Nelson's book, Economics as Religion, another example from a more, he thinks that's a good thing. More recently, Philip Goodchild's book, The Theology of Money, argues that money as a guarantor of all value holds the same place in modern society that God occupied in medieval times. The point, again, is that the hegemony of subtraction theories of secularization that prevailed in the 1960s has been broken. To read the signs of the times today, I think we need to entertain the possibility that Pope Francis is right. The realm of economics is not autonomous and drained of the sacred. Secularization is not the disappearance of the sacred, but the migration of a sense of the sacred from the church to other realms, from the sacraments to commodities. The people standing ready to burst into the Best Buy at midnight on Thanksgiving are not disenchanted people, right? That's the point. We're deeply enchanted. You Google Black Friday fights, and you come up with all kinds of images. Now, that this should be the case is nothing more startling than the basic biblical insight that people are spontaneously worshiping creatures, and our devotions regularly alight on all sorts of things that are not God. The biblical critique of idolatry, in other words, anticipated Durkheim and Schmidt by many centuries. Pope Francis need not have any direct contact with this kind of scholarship to intuit that the Bible's critique of idolatry is as pertinent today as it ever was. So, conclusion. So, is Pope Francis turning his back on Vatican II, returning to the days when the world was to be condemned rather than embraced? No, is the short answer, I think. And 3 comments are in order. First, Pope Francis's comments are as pertinent to those inside the church as outside. right? There's no sense that the church is somehow a refuge from the idolatry of the world. The enticement of money is something Francis warns his own bishops about. So idolatry critique should be, first and foremost, self-critique. Second, as we've seen, Francis rejects simple optimism, what he calls an Evangelii Gaudium, a crude and naive trust in the goodness of those wielding economic power. But he also rejects pessimism. What he counsels instead of either optimism or pessimism is hope, which is quite different from optimism. Francis recognizes that, as he says, quote, "The dragon, evil, is present in our history, but it does not have the upper hand. The one with the upper hand is God, and God is our hope," end quote. Third, and finally, there is a sense of hopefulness embedded in the critique of idolatry itself. That's what I want to end on. For the charge of idolatry recognizes the search for God that is rooted in every human heart. And here I want to connect with what Kathy Cavanaugh said about a kind of Augustinian sympathetic account of sin last night. We are spontaneously worshiping creatures because the longing for God is at the core of what it means to be human. So to return briefly to Gaudium et Spes, in its section on the community of mankind, Gaudium et Spes recognizes that the aim of all human life is God. For having been created in the image of God, who from one man has created the whole human race and made them live all over the face of the earth, all men are called to one and the same goal, namely God himself. The council is here quoting from Paul's speech to the Athenians in chapter 17 of the Acts of the Apostles. According to Acts, while staying in Athens, Paul, quote, "was deeply distressed to see that the city was full of idols," end quote. He proceeds to call them to repent of their idolatry, but he does so sympathetically because he sees their idolatry as an inchoate groping for the true God. He calls them deis daimonesterus, which literally means demon-fearing, which the NRSV translates as extremely religious. The King James version translates it as very superstitious, but the NRSV translates more sympathetically as extremely religious. He has seen their altar dedicated to an unknown God, and he wants to make God known to them. And so Paul says, God has created humans so that they would search for God and perhaps grope for him and find him, though indeed he is not far from each one of us. For in him we live and move and have our being, even as some of your own poets have said, for we too are his offspring. Since we are God's offspring, we ought not to think that the deity is like gold or silver or stone, an image formed by the art and imagination of mortals. End quote. So Paul thus deftly critiques the Athenians' idolatry while simultaneously seeing in it evidence for the desire of God that is at the core of our common humanity. And this, it seems to me, represents the spirit of Vatican II, a church open to the world, proclaiming the good news for the healing of our common wounds. Thank you.
Thank you, Bill. We have time for questions. Corey, would you be our microphone bearer again?
You're going to try to smoke me out, aren't you?
For that. Okay. Thanks for the presentation. It's actually very, very fascinating. One question I wonder if you could comment on, Bill, would be, do you think secularization against different religious backgrounds really, is so different? Say secularization of Judaism in Islam, secularization of Muslim countries, secularization, say, in the United States, where we've got the sacralization of the country through the Puritan tradition of American exceptionalism. Does it make sense even to talk about it all under the same rubric as secularization, or do we really need to particularize what's going on to take into account the background religious traditions that are at stake.
Right, yeah, absolutely. The more particular you can get, the better. Jose Casanova actually has a good essay on secularizations, in which he talks about that exact point, that you can't make these kind of broad generalizations. And that's one of the problems with secularization theories, this idea that there's one type of modernity that just kind of inevitably drains the world of the sacred. And clearly it's not the same in different places. And you can see that, I've talked about these kind of matters in my book, The Myth of Religious Violence. And when I gave talks in Sweden on that book, it's a very different sort of experience there, because the sacralization of the nation, although it's there in a certain way, but it's very different than the way that comes across in the United States. The issue of consumerism, on the other hand, is something that resonates with them in that way. And so I think absolutely you've got to be as particular about the context as you possibly can, and that's one of the difficulties with these kind of broad secularization theses. Yeah,
right here.
Thanks.
So the economy's at the forefront, and Francis has put it there, and it'll be at the forefront when he's here this fall, and we got the campaign and the election next year. You can't have idolatry and golden calf language in American society in the political context. Who's doing the best job translating the sacred that you just presented us into the political language of today, from the bishops, from the Pope? Who is making that transition the best into the language of politics and putting it in a way that the average citizen of the country can see the exclusionary economy and the concentration of wealth in a ethical framework, but not necessarily a outright religious language?
Yeah.
Who do you think is doing the best job at that? Candidates or thought leaders?
Wow. No, that would be really startling to see a candidate make some kind of gesture in that way. I mean, we've just seen the whole what happens to President Obama when he's not quite enthusiastically idolatrous enough about the nation. You see the kind of critique he gets from Rudy Giuliani that he doesn't love America because of this sort of thing. So I'd be startled to see this on the lips of any candidates. I think Pope Francis is really doing the best job of it at this point, but it does need. Actually, Mike Naughton was just telling me that Ken Goodpaster, who was here, he teaches in the business school here, has done some things on idolatry, and I suppose there's more of that needs to be done. But who's doing a good job of it in the public sphere? I couldn't tell you. I don't know. Elizabeth Warren, maybe. Yeah, I don't know if she uses that kind of language, but. There's a certain sort of popular bent in her language that I suppose could be amenable to this kind of thing. Yeah. Latin American church leaders talked about it all the time. Oscar Romero talked about idolatry all the time. Gutierrez talks about it a lot. It's much more muted here. Yeah. Yeah.
That was fascinating. Thank you. You've troubled and gotten me thinking. And in particular, given the U.S. cultural penchant for sacralizing the economic, I've spent most of my adult life working in parishes, one place or another. And what I've been increasingly distressedly aware of is the degree to which we have a tendency, and I don't excuse myself from this either, of becoming idolatrous about the way we interweave economics into the life of a parish community. Yeah. All of the things that happen in parishes that are driven by not perhaps understanding clearly enough how much we have let money become our God in shaping the life of our faith communities. Would you care to comment?
Yeah, no, I mean, It's pervasive. A lot of decisions get made on the basis of the budget and so on, which needs to be done. But more often than not, what I encounter is just a sort of silence about these issues, and it's not raised. But I mean, one point that I want to highlight is what you talked about. How kind of you said you yourself are not immune from this, and I want to make clear that I, of course, am not immune from it either. And one of the things that I'm trying to kind of put together, look at the interesting way that Francis can combine a sort of critique of idolatry with a positive affirmation of the world at the same time. So it's not this kind of finger pointing at somebody else saying you're idolatrous, and which is a very serious charge, you know, something that merits death in the Old Testament. But that's what I was trying to bring out at the end. There's a way in which there's something in the very charge of idolatry that, when viewed from the way Paul views it, or the way I think Augustine views it in the same way, is that it's a groping for God in ways that if we can latch onto, can really be brought into much more fruitful relationship with our faith, and that's the kind of thing that I think Pope Francis is trying to do.
Hi, me again, sorry. I think in the overall context, I'd like to hear something about not only Gaudium but Spes, but given the context of this talk, Populorum Progressio, which when it came out did not get a lot of talk in North America compared to Humani Generis, which seemed to be more, you know, North American values being challenged. But Populorum Progressio, I think, was taken much more seriously in the Third World. And to the extent that, you know, Medellin, there was this synod of bishops who took the option for the poor, fundamental option for the poor. And of course, Francis comes out of there. And other orders, I speak for the Jesuits, I know they took under Arupe, General Arupe, turned the direction of the Jesuits towards the fundamental option for the poor. And I think what we have in Francis now is the rising of that mentality, which comes as a huge surprise to Europe and North America. Late.
Yeah, I hope it doesn't come as too much of a surprise, but I think you're right. He's reconnecting with a much broader critique of economic realities that comes from Asia, Africa, and Latin America, and bringing that to the fore. I mean, if you read Benedict XVI and read Caritas in Veritate, it's really quite a radical critique of the economy as well. I don't think Francis has departed really that significantly from his predecessors. What he's done is bring it into his kind of public gestures and his pastoral emphasis on nearness to the poor that his predecessors just didn't quite have the genius for. But I think you're absolutely right to point to the whole background of Latin America. I mean, the promises of development that were made in the 1960s by the 1970s were obviously not going to be fulfilled. The poor were poorer in Latin America, and then you get a whole critique of developmentalism that I think you still find in there's a sort of optimism in developmentalism that you still find in the Vatican II documents that, at least by the 1970s, just appears dated and unrealistic in places like Latin America especially. Yeah, thank you.
Hi, Bill. Thank you. That was excellent. And I think certainly in the classroom it always helps with the language of idolatry. Students get that when you point it out to them and how it's so seeped into our culture. You almost answered my question before I could ask it, excuse me. But the language of idolatry, is this something that Francis has a new emphasis on compared to his predecessors, for instance, Benedict XVI in Caritas in Veritate or John Paul II? Or is this sort of a critique of continuity or a continuous critique from in the Catholic social tradition?
Yeah, that's a good
in terms of
question.
the language.
Right. Yeah, that's a good question. I've run a search of all the Vatican II documents and come up with just 3 mentions in passing of idol or idolatry. But I haven't done a similar search for the writings of Benedict XVI and John Paul II. And I think it would be really interesting to see. My sense is that they don't use the term nearly as much, that you'll find it occasionally. But with Francis, every time he talks about the economy, he talks about idolatry. And his collaborators have picked it up as well. Oscar Rodriguez, when he talks about the economy, he talks about idolatry constantly. I mean, it's really markedly a constant theme, and it's a theme, as I pointed out in the paper too, in Lumen Fidei, his first encyclical, which is not specifically talking about economic matters, but idolatry is a persistent theme. 14 times appears there as well. So it seems to me, it's a curious thing, of course, that people have noticed about Pope Francis, how much he talks about the devil and evil, and as a kind of personal presence. And it would be interesting to kind of connect his comments on idolatry with his comments about the devil as well, which strikes everybody as really being anomalous, given what a kind of happy-go-lucky figure he seems to be. And I don't know enough about his thought to talk about that intelligently, but it is interesting that the devil is a fallen angel, and it's the same sort of dynamic that you find, as Kathy was talking about last night. It's not that evil has this sort of primordial presence. Evil is a privation of good, a kind of falling away from good, and that's kind of what idolatry is about as well. So, yeah.
A couple questions came to mind as you were talking. The first was, how would you contrast Pope Francis's writings with, for example, John Paul II's 1991 Centesimus Annus, which was almost jubilant towards the capitalist growth coming out of the Cold War? And the second one is, you've done a lot of work on the state and the individual, and what would you say, as in my reading of Evangelium Gaudium, that Pope Francis gives an accent on the state or the political in more of a positive light than he does to, as he calls it, kind of the ethereal economy. But do you think that he may be missing something, or what would your comment be on the idolatry of the state that we can see as evident as you can see with the idolatry of the economy itself?
Yeah, gosh, 2 big questions. So Centesimus Annus has been spun as being a completely pro-capitalist document by people like Michael Novak, and I just don't think it is. You actually look at the document itself, and it's much, much more ambivalent about it. It recognizes the importance of free markets. He's coming out of the experience of communism, and so free markets are a good, but a qualified good, and a good that can only be good if it's kind of put within a larger ethical frame, and so on. So I really don't think that Centesimus Annus is the same kind of document that it's often spun to be. And so that's the first question of Centesimus Annus. The second question was about the Pope Francis and the state. I find papal social teaching in the 20th century tends to have a fairly benign view of the state in a kind of generically Thomist sort of way that I think it would be helpful if it were a little bit more critical. And at moments it is. When you get in Caritas in Veritate, for example, Benedict XVI talks about the state and market binary, and he's looking for ways to try to get away from it. And he goes both above and below. Below by encouraging all of these kinds of experiments in local economy and so on, and in even what he calls dispersed political authority, which I think is a wonderful phrase. And then on the other hand, in another paragraph, he's talking about world government and things like that. So kind of, you know, but it's a critique of the state kind of from above and below that is interesting and calls upon an earlier tradition, an earlier Catholic tradition in the late 19th and early 20th century of a more suspicious view of the state and an encouragement of the kind of proliferation of intermediary associations that have gotten kind of pushed out by, I think it's in Quadragesimo Anno, where he talks about this kind of, you know, the state and all that's left is the state and the individual. And so there's a kind of earlier Catholic social theory that's kind of looking for alternative spaces. I'm not sure that Pope Francis is terribly sophisticated on these matters yet, but he's clearly looking for, I mean, he's looking for the state, I think, to temper the worst inequalities of the market. And sometimes it does that, and sometimes it doesn't. I mean, I think one of the great myths of the current situation is that you've got the state and the market, and they're opposed to each other, and you've got a party of the state, the Democrats, and you've got a party of the market, the Republicans, and they're kind of opposing forces. I think more often than not, the state and the market have become intertwined. And so this opposition is a kind of false opposition. And so you get corporations that are too big to fail and are bailed out by the state, and all of the innumerable ways that the state and the corporation are interpenetrated. And I think there just needs to be more kind of realism, more recognition of that. Catholic social theory, I think, on these matters is not as sophisticated as it could be.
Thank you for being here. It's so good to have you back.
Oh, hey, Marta.
My question has to do follow up with the option for the poor. Pope Francis has been saying repeatedly, we want a church of the poor, a church for the poor. And that's exactly the same phrase and idea that John the 23rd said in the 60s. We want a church that is poor, a church for the poor. Yeah. So I just would like to ask you, how do you conceive this church for the poor, a church that is poor? And also, how do the realities of the third countries are informing the rest of the church that have not had that experience, and they don't see that poor as a theological place? What do they tell us about hope, the hope that Pope Francis is talking about?
Right. Wow. Thanks, Marta. Those are big questions and excellent questions. I think it's not a coincidence that this is our first pope from the global south, and he's bringing these issues to light in ways that we haven't had them kind of brought to the center in the past. This is one of the things that people are always kind of shocked to learn, people in our classrooms, that the center of the gravity of the church has gone south, so that at the beginning of the 20th century, 2/3 of Catholics were in the north, and now 2/3 are in the south, and the reality there is of poverty is of central importance. And so I think that's absolutely being put front and center. What it would mean to be a church of the poor and for the poor, I think Francis is really trying to get people to experiment with what that might mean. And he said just recently that the kind of first commandment of parish life is closeness to the people, and I think closeness to where people are suffering. This image of the church as field hospital again, that what we need to do is go out and find people who are suffering, and you don't have to look very far, and be with them and heal their wounds. And I think that's exactly the kind of church that he's calling us to. I don't know if there's any such thing as a blueprint of what that might mean. But I think one of the things it might mean, just to tie in with the previous question, is it might mean less emphasis on lobbying, and more emphasis on just kind of going out into the streets and starting experiments in different kinds of economies, in different kinds of communities, and not this kind of, we seem addicted to this sort of top-down approach that when there's poverty, the only thing we can think to do is, send lobbyists to Washington. And I think Pope Francis is calling us to just, go out, as Jesus says to the disciples, you give them something to eat, and I think that's kind of what we're being called to. Thanks. Yeah.
Actually, I have something more in the spirit of a comment than a question. We can save the questions for lunch and beer. A member of the audience who will remain nameless. This is in the spirit, by the way, of pointing the finger at ourselves, first of all. Pointed out the uncomfortable similarity between the Cathedral of Consumption that you pictured for us up there in the building we're in. And the comment that I will attribute by name to my late colleague, our late colleague and good friend Terry Nichols, who never denied it when I reminded him he'd said it, De mortuis nihil nisi bonum. He said, St. Thomas, with tongue firmly planted in cheek, is dedicated to proving that Jesus was wrong when he said you can't serve both God and money. It's just biting the hand that feeds you. But I only say this because this conference is about teaching the document 50 years later. We all are, most of us are in the education industry, and we know that we have an unsustainable business model, and changes are coming, and we'll have a chance to find out how ready we are to be pinched ourselves, as I think we're likely to be. So.
Yeah. Thanks.
I'd like to follow up on an earlier point you made about the two forces of corporate capitalism and the state, and that they're in alliance with each other. But why is not more attention being given to like worker-owned businesses, co-ops, that sort of thing? In the spirit of Mondragon, even Chesterton's distributism, there are some references in I think some of the John the 23rd encyclicals to that, but within the last 50 years, very little explicit mention made of that, including Gaudium Spes, as sort of as an option, as a way to move forward.
Right. Yeah.
And I just wondered about that.
Yeah. Well, I talk about the Mondragon cooperative in my book, Being Consumed, and that's part of what I try to do is bring up all of these kind of grassroots examples. And that's exactly what I was talking about before with this kind of, we get addicted to this kind of top-down approach. And I think it would be to energize the faithful to kind of go out and engage in all kinds of kind of grassroots experiments is in the spirit of what the Latin American Church, I think, has tried to do with basic Christian communities. But it's also in the spirit of, again, this kind of other Catholic tradition that tends to get ignored with our emphasis on the state, of subsidiarity in this way of kind of trying all sorts of other kind of grassroots economic experiments. I wrote an article a couple of years ago, it's in the Journal of Moral Theology, on looking at this little town in Iowa called Westphalia, Iowa. It's in western Iowa. And all of the kind of economic experiments that they were doing before Vatican II, they had this priest who kind of ran the town. It was this all-Catholic town, and they had a cooperative bank, they had a cooperative market, they had a cooperative garage, they had a cooperative beauty salon. They had all of these kind of economic cooperatives that were kind of woven into the liturgical life of the town and so on. And I got in touch with people in Westphalia and had them do a sort of survey on this to see what was good and bad about that situation. The old timers remember it and what it's like now. And now, of course, all of that has kind of fallen apart, and they shop at Walmart, 10 miles away. And so, and what I was asked to write an essay. The reason I wrote this was I was asked to write an essay on the relationship of the church and world. And what we're usually told is before Vatican II, the church was against the world, and then after Vatican II, the church embraced the world. And I think that's half right. These little Catholic enclaves where Protestants were not kind of welcome and so on. I mean, I'm glad those are no longer there. But there's a sense in which that church was more worldly because it was actually kind of engaged with the nitty-gritty of what economy means, right? We are otherworldly in the sense that, as Wendell Berry says, what we do with the economy is delegate it to other people. Right? The economy now is this vague abstraction run by experts somewhere else in New York and Washington, over which we have no control, but to whose vagaries we are subject. And so suddenly, the economy has changed, and people are being thrown out of work and thrown out of their houses and so on. And there's this feeling of kind of helplessness and abstraction when we talk about economic matters. Whereas in this kind of community, economy meant the day-to-day interactions with material goods and with your neighbors, and in some ways that's a more worldly sort of thing, and in some ways that's kind of what I'm looking for is the attempt to kind of make economy something that's grounded and real and material and local and something you can touch and see rather than just these kind of vague abstractions. The macro stuff needs to be talked about and needs to be analyzed and so on, but I think you're absolutely right. The micro stuff just doesn't get any attention, and it needs to be if we're really to be worldly.
I think we have to draw an end to our question-answer time. Please join me in thanking Bill for sharing his insights.
Thank you.
Thursday, I said I was pleased to introduce this conference, and Saturday at noon, I say I'm a bit sad to conclude the conference. But given the nature of the past couple of days, it's probably better to say we're adjourning this, that we'll continue to talk about, to think about, and to teach Gaudium et Spes in the future. On behalf of the committee that planned this and the theology department, I thank our four keynote speakers. I thank all of you, the 40 scholars who presented papers to us, and I thank especially our participants who stuck with us through these long days. It was a long day yesterday. Thank you for that. I remind you, if you wouldn't mind taking the time to fill out an evaluation. Thank you. And I like to end on what I think remains, at least to me, one of the most profound statements of the Second Vatican Council, the first paragraph of Gaudium et Spes. The joys and the hopes and griefs of the anxieties of people of this age, especially those who are poor or in any way afflicted, which of course is you and I and the person next to you and the next person you meet when you leave. The joys and hopes and griefs and the anxieties of people of this age, especially those who are poor or in any way afflicted. These are the joys and hopes and griefs and anxieties of the followers of Christ. Thank you very much.